Come join me as I make this two-tiered guitar cake. I started with mixing up some chocolate batter for the bottom tier of this cake. I put that into two 8-inch cake pans. Once I was finished getting that prepped, I moved on to making some orange batter, and I put that into three 6-inch cake pans. After I did that, I was able to bake them, took them out of the oven, and here's what they look like. Here's the orange cakes, and here are the two chocolate cakes. I allowed those to cool just briefly, and then I took them out of the pans and I leveled them off, and I wrapped them up so that we could let them cool and to lock in some of that moisture for the cakes. I did the same thing for the chocolate cakes. Took them out of the pan, leveled them off, and then wrapped them to seal in that moisture for the cakes. After I was finished with that, I started to prepare my icing. I'm making some peanut butter icing for the chocolate tier, and I'll also be making some chocolate icing for the top orange tier. Started to prep my icing bags with some peanut butter icing, another bag with chocolate icing, and another bag with vanilla icing. Of course, this is the peanut butter bag. Then I mixed up my chocolate icing and also prepared that bag. Once I finished prepping my bags, I was able to start stacking my cakes. So I took my cake board. I used a little bit of vanilla icing to put onto my cake board so that my cakes are not sliding around as I'm decorating. And I'm starting with that bottom chocolate tier. Spread out that icing and then started stacking the cakes. Here I am adding an extra bit of a dam so that I can put some extra peanut butter icing in between these two cakes. And here I already noticed that my icing was a bit too thick. I was able to work through it, but I really should have made this a little less stiff of an icing. Put on the second layer and started to crumb coat the cake. And now I'm beginning to use the peanut butter icing to actually ice this cake. And again, as I mentioned, this icing is a bit too thick, but I was able to work through using this. Lesson learned for next time. And I'm trying to smooth out the sides of this peanut butter icing. Then I was able to move on to the top layer. And this is the orange layer with chocolate icing, but I'm going to stack first. Notice I'm using a much smaller cake board because that will go in between the two layers and I don't want it to be seen. So I started to stack the cake, added some icing so that I can add the second layer of this cake. And now adding some more icing before I put on the third layer. Here is where I'm going to see the second lesson to be learned as I'm watching and editing this video. So as I am preparing to put on this third layer, I didn't get low enough to see, to make sure that my cakes were in line. So when I put this third one on, you will see that it's not quite centered on top of the other two cakes. And then I started to crumb coat this cake. You can see here that it's not even. Once I got that finished, I went back and worked on the peanut butter icing, and I'm just cleaning that up to make it as smooth as possible. I'm using some hot water to make my smoother here hot so that it helps to smooth. Once I was finished with that, I moved on to the top tier and was covering that with the chocolate icing that was requested. And I proceeded then to smooth out this icing. And then I began to use the bench scraper to further smooth the icing. And after that was finished, I switched back to my peanut butter cake and I started to really add some structure to the cake so that it can hold up that top tier. I'm adding 6 different straws here. You'll notice there's a line around the outside. I used a 6-inch pan to help guide where I would put these straws. Once they were in, I used some peanut butter icing and just covered up those holes so that they were covered. After that was done, I went back and I tried to further smooth this chocolate cake. Chocolate icing, I'm sorry. It's an orange cake with chocolate icing. And I used some hot water again to help keep my spatula warm so that it would help me to smooth this better. And after I was finished with getting this smoothed out, I went back and I went to stack my cake. So you can see I put the orange with chocolate on top of the chocolate with peanut butter icing, smoothed up that icing again from where I picked up the cake, and continued to smooth that till it was ready to go. Then I added a line of peanut butter icing along the base of this to cover up that gap that's between the two layers. And then I chilled this cake while I made the top decorations for the cake. Here I am putting some chocolate into my melter. I'm going to use this to make a rock and roll hand that will go on top of this cake. So after it was melted, I put it into the mold. Here's the mold all filled. And then once that was all set up, after I allowed that to cool, I went to take my molded chocolate out of the hand, or out of the mold, my apologies. So it was tough to get out of this mold, and as I was pulling it out, two of the fingers, the two that are up in the rock and roll, I was quite frustrated, but both of the fingers broke off, and so then I had to work to put those back together. So I used some other chocolate to attach the fingers back to the hand, and then I used some of my fondant tools to sculpt the hand back together. And here I am just using some of that chocolate to put it back on, put the fingers back onto the hand. So I left it dry just a little bit, added some additional chocolate, and just worked it to solidify those together. And as I mentioned, after it dried a little bit, I used my fondant tools to sculpt it back together. And there we go, good as new. Then I began to move on to some of my fondant work, and I am going to be making some flames that will go on the bottom of each of the tiers. So I use some Tylose powder here to help solidify, or to make this harden a little harder. I use some yellow, orange, and red fondants and blended them together a bit to make what would look like flames for the cake. Again, there's the Tylose powder that I mentioned to make it become a bit more firm. And here I took a little bit from each of the three colors and just kind of twisted them together a little bit so that they don't blend fully, so that you can see some of all of the colors coming through. And then I used this flame mold for the bottom layer, and I used a different flame mold for the top layer. I made several of these for each one of the two molds, so that I can line it the entire way around each of the bottom of the tiers. And once I pressed that in, I pulled it off. Then I used an X-Acto knife and I cut those out so that it was just, so we could get rid of all that excess fondant around the edges. This part is quite tedious, trying to cut around each of these curves. This is what it kind of looked like. Then I went over to add some chocolate into this guitar mold that I had intended to put on the front of the cake. This is the 4th time that I have tried to do this using this mold. Unfortunately, the other 3 times it broke at the mold once, or at the neck of the guitar when I took it out of the mold. And sadly, later you'll see, well, maybe not see in this video, but sadly this also broke, so I ended up not being able to use it on the cake. I did give it to the individual who wanted this cake. This time when I did it, I had even added some additional chocolate along the top to really try to help make that a stronger bond, but it just wasn't working. So I think the design of this mold could be improved by doing a shorter neck, because I tried several different ways to do this and it just was not coming together for me. I did want to include it in the video though, because it was supposed to be part of the process. And here's what it looked like once I had it all ready to dry for the cake. Then I moved on to making some black skulls for placement on the cake. Once I took them out of the mold, I went back and again I cut off the excess fondant from each of the sides from these. And that's what they look like. And here are all of them finished. I think they turned out really great. I moved on then to adding some chocolate into some little guitar molds. And these ones turned out, some of them turned out, ironically, some of these were too small. Unlike the other one that kept breaking, it was too big. These were a little bit too small in some spots on the mold, so I had luck with some, no luck with others. I also added some chocolate to these little tiny skulls to also make a different type of skull to add on to the cake. I just tapped out the extra air on there and I'm putting these into the fridge to cool. Now they've cooled and I'm taking them out of the mold, and you'll see that I was able to get these 2 guitars out. And then I began to cut off the excess of the guitars for where the excess chocolate came out of the mold. Same thing for these little skulls. I took them out of the mold and then broke them up and cut off the excess chocolate from them. And here we are trying to cut off those excess pieces of chocolate. Once I was finished with that, I went back, and this was a little while later. I started to cut off the excess chocolate from the outside of this mold. Once I got it out, I wanted to go back and paint the white part of this a blue color. Here I am mixing a little bit of a glitter luster dust into it so that we can get some glitter color into this guitar color. And I just proceeded with painting this guitar. And this is candy dye, so not traditional food or gel dye. And after I was finished painting it, this is what it looked like. Added some black in some of the spots in the center of the guitar. Then I moved on to taking those smaller skulls, and I used gold luster dust and just kind of tapped it onto each one of them. And I really love how these turned out. This luster dust was really vibrant. Did a great job covering the chocolate. After I was finished doing all of this, I was able to move on to actually putting the cake together. So I took some of those smaller flames that I made, and I used a little bit of gel paste to add to the back of each one of them, and that allowed me to stick them to the cake and them to stay. Here it is with the flames on. Now I am using 2 skewers, and I'm kind of screwing them into the bottom of the hand. I'm going to use those to help brace the hand into the top of the cake. As you can see where I marked I was going to put it, I put a little bit of icing on the bottom of the hand to help hold it in place. And along with those skewers, that'll really help keep it in place. I also began to put the skulls placed randomly and the guitars you see on the top tier, which I also covered with a purple luster dust. I also did a center support here, which I don't show it in the video, but I did put a center support into this cake, in through the top, bottom, and down into the bottom cake board. And here I'm just placing the skulls and the guitars all throughout the cake, just sporadically. here was where I was considering where I was going to put that guitar. And that's when I decided it probably wasn't a good idea to add it to the cake, because I feared it was going to break before I could get it delivered, because I know it's not very stable. And here I'm just putting a couple on the top, just kind of laying in front of this hand. I really like the way that looked once it was finished. Here I'm just sitting back and looking at it to see if I like how that looks, and I did decide that I liked it. And with that, I think we have the final version of this cake with one or two more additions. Here I'm cleaning up a little bit of the gel that is on the back of that, and here's the final product. Kind of doing a spin of the cake and a few different views of the cake, different angles. And with that, I would love to thank you for coming and watching as I made this cake. I appreciate your support. I would love if you would like, comment, and share this video with those around you. Thank you once again. I appreciate your support.